Soft Countriana is a consumer aesthetic that flourished from the 1970s to early 1990s that is composed of pastels, country geese, storybook creatures, and homages to the Victorian era. It describes the aesthetic that was most popular amongst conservative grandmas in the 1980s, and it was popularized by brands like Laura Ashley, Hallmark, Paula Vaughan, and Gunne Sax. Today I'm joined by Evan Collins, the founder of the Consumer Aesthetics Research Institute, to discuss Soft Countriana in detail. Hi, Evan.
Hey there.
How are you doing today?
Pretty good, yeah.
Yeah. So you're back in Chicago this week. You know, it's been around a year since you last came on the pod to discuss Whimsicraft. How have you been doing?
Pretty good. Yeah, I mean, we're just continuing in Kari to develop the research out further, and especially kind of to develop a bit more like our academic research standards. We have a lot of people inside Kari that are doing a great job of that, kind of alongside myself. While I focus on more kind of expanding our research into different areas, we are working a lot harder to develop intensive sort of motifs and standards for how to catalog and crystallize an aesthetic, along with opening up more academic research avenues to other interested researchers.
Yeah, I learned about that a bit recently in one of the Kari labs. So Sophie Jian, who is working with Kari, she's been doing these Kari labs once a month where people outside of Kari who are interested in internet aesthetics or consumer aesthetics can come and present to you guys. And I did that with Brianna a couple of weeks ago. It was pretty fun.
Yeah, I was really excited. That's such a perfect idea. I'm really glad that we were able to work that out and get those going, because that's been a long time goal to get more and more people interested and make our work and research accessible to more people to bring their particular interests over to us. And then I love providing that we can provide feedback to other people's work and, just see how it interacts. And that's been a very helpful avenue for us to kind of develop out further with these lab sessions.
Yeah. I mean, speaking from experience, it's a lot of fun to meet people who actually care about aesthetics, you and I.
Yeah.
I mean, there's literally an endless list of things we could talk about.
Yes, I know.
Yeah.
It always gets,
Yeah.
It could just go on forever.
And today we're actually going to be discussing an aesthetic that is, relatively obscure because it hasn't been listed on the Kari page as of yet. It's called Soft Countriana. It's an aesthetic that I believe you first identified, right?
Yeah, back around, say like mid 2022. It's an aesthetic that we kind of always sort of knew existed, but it felt like people really hadn't been even attempting to delve into it because they hadn't really seen any value in doing so. And so it had not really been on our Kari radar beyond just a few random mentions over the course of our history, up until, recently, as of, 2022, 2023, that we really started to actually attempt to pick it apart and found, a lot more interesting elements to it and kind of context.
Yeah. It's an aesthetic that has been existing on your arena page for a while. So for people who don't know, there are the, sort of Kari stamped aesthetics that have been vetted and you've worked on it with everyone else. But on your own, you have an arena page where you start to group images together. The names are kind of tentative. The ideas are a bit tentative, but it's interesting to look through those ones that haven't, become official yet.
Yeah, they're kind of the proving ground of whether, something I do try to even hold off on creating those pages until I think I have something that is like a core. I think something that I can work with, or there's some actual cohesive identity there between those aesthetics before I even create those arena boards. But yeah, they are definitely a lot of these kind of just first work in progress avenues that we're looking into.
Yeah. On Arena, is there the option to keep boards private until you're ready to publish them?
Yep, and I've got like 40 of those at the they're still totally private because I can't even put them out there yet. Really got to feel that it's sort of even worthwhile that I'm really picking up on something before I can even really present it as a public work in progress.
So to start out discussing Soft Countriana, I want to pose the question, what do you think the key demographic is? Because we're discussing consumer aesthetics. What do you think the key consumer of Soft Countriana was?
Yeah, so that's extremely important. Basically, whenever we're talking about our entire sort of research focuses around these determining kind of these consumer styles and consumer segments and why they're created in the first place and who are they to appeal to. So in thinking about that in relation to Soft Countriana, it does really feel like a very like feminine,
Hmm.
femme-coded aesthetic, specifically in the context of the 70s and 80s. It seems very suburban middle class and upper middle class mom aesthetic. I mean, it could yeah, it's just generally that I think that I believe that demographic is kind of what was most specifically focused on,
Yeah.
yeah, very, like, feminine aesthetic for sure, at least, but yeah, that seems like people with some disposable income to spend on these, like, kind of trinkets and doodads and stuff like that and the fashion. But yeah, that
Yeah.
this seems like that's the most close idea, and it seems like it's kind of easy to determine just from how well, like, how specifically structured this aesthetic is and how, like, it does
Yeah.
feel pretty cohesive in that regard.
The way I like to think about it in the shorthand
Mm,
way is, Whimsicraft, that was the aesthetic of zany art teachers in the
mm,
90s. This one, the way I'm thinking about it, is it was the aesthetic of conservative grandmas in the 80s. And this is an aesthetic that, I mean, it could appeal to mothers who are a bit
mm,
younger, but it also has this really interesting timelessness to it, or this appeal to all age groups, because I imagine that, yes, this was marketed to grandmas, but it was marketed to grandmas who would look at these Soft Countriana
mm.
wares and be like, "Oh, my granddaughter would love that." Like everything
Yeah,
with teddy bears, everything that like feels sort of girly in this juvenile way.
mhm.
Yeah, it appealed to both, in a certain way.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely true because you can see there's, like, different segments of it where it's, like, it could be for sure grandmas and, like, in quilts and these older Victorian homes and things, but it goes all the way down to and we can speak on it later, but the fact that even Victoria's Secret originally had this style to
Oh,
it.
it did?
Yeah, absolutely. It was super soft, frilly, and you're really pretty well covered, even in the lingerie and stuff like that. So it appealed to a quite a wide age demographic, and the kind of you'd have like little girls in these like very flowy, frumpy, like little like balloon. What is it? A balloon shoulder thing. Like it's very strange to look back onto it, kind of from our current perspective. But it did. You're right. It did appeal to a wide range,
Yeah.
age
There's
range.
this
Yeah, sorry.
one. Okay, so we did put together a Pinterest board like last time. I don't believe this is on the Pinterest board. It's on your arena page, but there's this
Mm.
image that looks like it was made out of some sort of fibers craft, but it's of like a grandma just hugging her grandson. And I feel like
It's
that's the heart of this.
it kind yeah, and it's very like homey and very yeah, it's like, down to earth family traditions and like, sharing family amongst generations. It is very like it would, we could kinda get to it, like a very, traditional family it's a bit conservative sort of in its like values, ideas, but a bit of this and it could be spoken to like this sort of like romanticism of just, so everything's like feeling and it is very like, warm family vibes kind of.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's family in a very particular way. I mean, I think you were sort of framing it as maybe this was a fixation on gender roles. But in my opinion, it was really just like familial roles, because it's
Mm,
really this intergenerational concept of like you are like a granddaughter, a daughter, a mother, a wife, a grandma, and it's the same sort of drive that brings people to say put like mom or dad first in their Twitter bios, even
mm.
if they're like the CEO of a company or a politician, where it's
Ah.
like, that's your most important role in life. And these people are kind of clear-eyed about like how important family is.
Yeah, when I think about it kind of in that context, it does feel like I mean, I could be totally talking out of like that out of my depth or something, but it does feel like it's related to that weird like emergence of the sort of like yeah, like almost this like Reaganite era
Mhm.
of like, it's morning in America, like we're family, it's, I am very focused on my traditional family values and that kind of stuff and like the moral majority. It's like that kind of weird realm of this like back to America tradition type stuff where it does feel like that. I mean, in the sense of the gender roles, it's interesting how this aesthetic almost I mean, it's like, there's, like, no men at all,
Oh
which is
no,
just they're just, like, no they're, like, absent, which is kind of
completely
interesting. It's
absent.
like it's just sort of like this sort of gauzy looking, like, woman's world or something of different of, like, activities and things, and this sort of
Yeah.
idealized, romanticized country mixed with suburban
Yeah.
landscape and idealized world.
Yeah, and I do wanna address that a little bit too. So, the aesthetic definitely
Mm.
wasn't urban, but it is a romanticization of the countryside that was largely suburban. You know, a
Mm.
lot of the artwork on the Pinterest board on the Arena page, it has, like, sort of homages to nature. I mean, sometimes it's directly, like, represented in the backgrounds, but it'll be things like teddy bears, Easter bunnies,
Mhm.
country geese, these really soft animals that are not really naturalistic. So, how does this connect to the countryside in suburbia?
Yeah, it's from what I can tell from this, it's like this version of the country where it's like purely aesthetic to be consumed or to exist
Yeah.
within, but not really to be actually interacted with on any meaningful level. It's not to, you don't really ever see any imagery in this aesthetic of like someone doing like hard or like dirty manual labor in a farm or something like that. Like no one's getting down and dirty and like picking out like carrots out of the thing or something. And there it's more just like the product of it. You'll see like jellies and jams or just like
Yeah.
someone playing with like a frilly white cloth or something. And everything is always perfect. There's even an image on the Pinterest or the arena board of like this woman like kind of getting down close to the creek or something, but she is not dirtied her outfit
Yeah.
whatsoever. She's like perfectly like
Wearing all
yeah,
white.
yeah, wearing all white, perfectly clean outfit, just barely touching the water. It's a very sort of strange relationship with nature. It's like sort of a very synthetic, artificial relationship, which is very representative of where people would be at or where that consumer would be at
Mhm.
in the mid 1980s, where you're living your suburban lifestyle, but you have like you're yearning a little bit for this
Mhm.
idealized version where it's a very idealized version of a rural lifestyle without the dirt and grit and
Yeah.
without maybe the labor. It's just a purely aesthetic romanticization of that.
Yeah, I mean,
It's
that's
very
what the
strange.
suburban lifestyle is trying to sell.
Mm,
It is both, like, urban and rural amenities where you get
mm.
to enjoy both. But, I mean, when thinking about this, you had mentioned that a lot of the homes that look Soft Countriana, those were in, like, traditional streetcar suburbs.
Yeah, they're from kind of what I understand about like Victorian architecture of that time period. I mean, Victorian era when they were building tons of these, homes in the really the late 19th century, really the late 19th century. Um, that was a period of rapid urbanization, rapid industrialization,
Yeah.
the proliferation of railroads and streetcars, and the kind of the formation of the fabric that would then create our modern cities.
Yes.
And that context, you're not like a frontier, person on the edge of society, creating your homestead on the farm. You're really part of a neighborhood. I mean, you're part of the rest of the context of society. But even back then, from my understanding, I mean, streetcar suburbs that were suburbs that followed along the earliest lines of streetcar railroads, in cities,
Yes.
and that became a form of mass transit. Those were marketed as like you have your own little mini homestead with a tiny plot of land, and that kind of plot of land is your own curated version of the farm. It's
Mhm.
it's very aesthetic, it's very idealized, and you don't really have to do any of the labor that's associated with that because you now have these like trappings of industrialization and grocery stores and things that were emerging that made life much more comfortable, but you still kind of want the aesthetic of having this more like hard spun lifestyle and stuff at the
Yeah.
same time. So it's an interesting interplay between those two.
Yeah. I mean, it's important for
Mm,
listeners to know this.
mm,
Suburbanization did not start with the suburbs of the 1950s with the introduction of the automobile.
mm. Yeah.
Every form of transportation, it decreased the need to concentrate populations in city centers, and it caused population densities to go down, starting with train
Mm,
lines
mhm.
and then cable cars, streetcars, up until the car. Each wave, it caused like cities to sprawl more and more. And so what Soft Countriana is it's really a nostalgia for the first wave of the suburbs. Suburban people yearning for the very first suburbs to emerge that were along streetcar lines in a certain way.
Yeah, and it's also interesting when you mention that because what those sort of represented at the time is that those suburbs that were being created to my understanding, they were like very well off. I mean, they were like not very easily achievable for like the average person, especially in that time period, which is, industrialization, the Gilded Age, a lot of people, there was not really as much of a middle class. So what people are sort of romanticizing is the fact that the wealthy kind of were escaping a lot of the really, really dense, rough, dirty, polluted tenements and the urban core and stuff at that time.
Yeah.
And they were kind of seeking these far-flung streetcar suburbs that were, cleaner air. They had the little bits of nature that they could reserve for themselves outside of what was becoming like, a very heavily industrialized, full of factories, full of soot and smoke and pollution in, both in sort of industrialized economies at that time. So it's this weird romanticization of early suburbs done by later suburbs.
Yeah.
It's sort of a weird, strange thing.
Yeah, it's interesting. That nostalgia is definitely part of why this aesthetic first emerged. But let's start to talk more in depth about why the aesthetic emerged.
For sure.
Yeah. So, I mean, this partly has to do with the Victorian era and the Edwardian era sort of becoming not popular, but people started to think about it, pay attention to it more because during urban renewal, it was targeted a lot. I mean, especially in the United Kingdom. But the Victorian society, that is partly responsible for like rejuvenating interest in Victoriana and Victorian architecture and things like that.
Yeah, you had kind of what was interesting about that is that it was one of the first waves, really. I mean, basically the first sort of structured wave of historic preservation amongst in the UK and in the US, where before, those Victorian homes were not seen. I mean, after they were kind of constructed, they were seen after the issues with like various world wars and the Great Depression. They were seen by the 1920s and 30s and 40s as like these overly gaudy, overly ornate, just ridiculous, kind of basically the McMansions of their day. They were kind of seen in that sort of context that they were like absolutely ridiculous for people to have constructed these in such a sort of frivolous manner. And, in the context of the 1940s to the 1960s, both urban renewal and the, huge rise in sort of modernist styles that happened at that time, it was seen as completely, unnecessary for these like very ornamental, architectural styles to be around at all. I mean, they were, as everyone more people know, various other like older ornate buildings were being torn down, like Penn Station and various.
Yeah, I mean, this was the birth of the historic preservation movement. It was in the mid-century.
Yeah, because basically the reaction to the sort of demolition of a lot of these, incredible landmarks of earlier architectural history. People had these kind of grassroots movements that existed in the UK, as you mentioned, and then also like San Francisco was a huge epicenter for this because, at the time, basically with sort of urban like white flight and urban renewal and sort of the urban decay of that time period, you're seeing a lot of disuse and abandonment of these older ornate, basically what we now call I believe it's the painted ladies of San Francisco. Like they were not considered valuable at all at that time. And, this sort of context of fascination with them and their revitalization and historic preservation really comes about exactly in this era.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because I had recently learned that in the mid-century, Victorian architecture was targeted during urban renewal in part because like in the mid-century, like after World War II, the UK, they hadn't recovered from the war as quickly as the United States did. And so they felt mocked by these 100-year-old buildings with such grandeur. And they felt like it was an accomplishment if they could knock it down and replace it with something that was new and modern. And I don't know, I've realized, I will get to this again throughout the episode, but like this particular topic made me realize like decades prior to the internet, so much less monocultural than I thought. Like it's possible for there to be multiple trends, where Victorian stuff is both despised by one facet of the population and then cherished by another.
Yeah, no, that's one thing we've learned over kind of the course of delving into all sorts of Kari aesthetics is that, back then, one group, so many little different subsects of people can be doing completely the opposite thing at the same time and not even be really aware of each other. Which is particularly, is definitely fascinating sort of phenomenon that just cannot really exist now.
And then I want to pose a question to you. So would you say that this aesthetic, is it more British or American, or is it neither?
You know what? That is genuinely tough because yeah, when I started researching this, I came from a purely American perspective and I was like
Mhm.
not even really thinking about the UK in this regard. But then when I actually started looking at some of these original examples, I did see a mention of like, like British textiles and oh, this sort of relationship with like what we kind of spoke about before, like in Whimsicraft about like Mackenzie Childs and this like
Mhm.
and this actual tradition of British folk art being really just as important, or if not more so, than the sort of American counterpart. But I believe, I mean, just because of the fact that both of those societies were kind of the British kind of earlier, but then America at the same similar time were undergoing the same type of like social economic forces that led to the creation of this style, where the UK has kind of, I don't know if it's as much of the country aspect. I guess it's
Yeah, for
yeah.
me, I thought that this aesthetic was way more American initially because we have a more rural
Mm,
population. There are more people out there like hunting. But really, I mean, this doesn't have anything to do with like the true countryside.
yeah,
This
that's
is
exactly, yeah.
like more of a British like fantasy of the countryside.
Yeah, it reminds me of and I can't remember the exact name, but there was a tradition of like park design that related to the fact of like the way that parks were designed in the late 18th century, sorry, late 19th century, or both. Where it was related
Yeah.
with like people kind of really crafting the landscape. It's a style of park design. There's a specific term for it, where parks are designed to have this. I think it's like a romanticist ideal of this like imagined landscape and craft that into reality. It's not
Like
naturalistic.
Central
It's
Park is
yeah,
an
it's
example.
like
Mhm.
entirely about, and they would construct these little structures known as like follies that would be like faux ruins and stuff like that, or these non-functional structures. And it just that idea about kind of manipulating the landscape to really fit an aesthetic ideal as opposed to actually having it be more of like this functional or naturalistic version does relate a lot to kind of the ideas of this style too that were revived later on.
Yeah. And then another source of Soft Countriana, it's partly coming out of the gay 90s. So this is a consumer aesthetic I didn't know about before this week. Can you give an explanation?
Yeah, so this one I'm learning a lot about a lot more about this as well, more recently. So the gay 90s refers to the 1890s, and it was coined, I believe, in 1927 as a part of a book that was it was the gay 90s reminiscences on an earlier era, or like a similar book. We can put it in the description. But it was actually really fascinating because it's what I believe is one of the earliest examples, at least, really codified, written, like a real obvious written example of a later era having this nostalgic fascination with the prior one. And
Yeah.
since this was in 1927, it's about 30-year trend cycle, which is sort of interesting. Um, and the way that that term was coined with this book, it was just filled with these little illustrated vignettes of particular cultural fascinations that people had, with the little trends and fads and sort of odd social customs of the 1890s that this person in the late 1920s was reminiscing about, or even mocking in some instances. And that idea about the 1890s having this really intense romanticized feel to it,
Mhm.
amongst later generations, partially because of, after the 1890s, you hit. This ends really about the end of the Victorian era, the end of the Belle Epoque, like right around the turn of, the start of World War One. You have a
Yeah.
bunch of like this very harsh time periods of war and rapid industrialization and rapid social change, and then World War II, and what that sort of this 1890s period became sort of representative of this sort of idealized world prior to all of the stress and struggles of this
Yeah.
sort of the new modern world of the 1920s and 30s. And that actually just kept going. I was surprised initially because our work, when it started, we only had understanding of the gay 90s and this revival of it, as being part of like the 1960s and 70s. That was kind of as far back as our research went. But then looking at actually the Wikipedia for the page, it goes all the way back. And it started in 1925 with this coining of the term. but it kept going. It kept popping up in culture. In the 1930s, there was a gay 90s themed bar in New York, which was like themed places in 1930s. Seems like incredible. Like it seems like much more recent thing. But from that point on, you had a lot of movies throughout the 1930s, 40s, 50s, 60s. You had musicals. I think the last one really was like Hello Dolly, which was like one of the big last musicals of that time period, was also gay 90s themed. And then when we look like kind of more into the time period that we look into from the 60s and 70s, it is incredible how omnipresent it is. It shows up. There's actually even an old theme park in Chicago called Old Chicago. And it was a gigantic building themed entirely around 1890 Victorian gay 90s sort of pretend culture carnival going on in there.
I mean, it's crazy to hear that people love the 1890s this much, because low-key, like, when people ask me like what my favorite decade is, I do say that sometimes, because that was when, public transit systems were getting built, like the technology for skyscrapers was being developed, and like American cities were like starting to peak. I mean, that wasn't really their peak, but they were starting to get there. But yeah, I mean, it's like looking at this aesthetic on the Kari page, it's very masculine. It has a lot of like medium browns, dark browns. It's sort of more like Wild West themed, would you say?
Yeah, it's like one of those styles where it's like an overarching term for like there's so many little facets to it. But definitely, I believe kind of once it hit its like later oversaturation point in the 60s and 70s, it did become particularly tuned to this weird fascination and romanticization of the Old West, like saloons and burlesque and boudoir and brass fixtures and all this, and like stained glass, and this idea of like conquering the Old West. And that did definitely trend in that direction. But it's a lot to parse because it lasted for so long, and it's been sort of outside of our scope of research to delve any further before like the late 60s.
They go too far back.
But it's actually really fascinating. It's something that deserves kind of like a whole book or something of its own to understand it.
I mean, maybe its own episode one day, but I mean, it's worth bringing up in relation to Soft Countriana, because I think, they're both romanticizing relatively the same time period. I mean, Soft Countriana, it's the whole Victorian era, which lasted 70 years. Gay 90s, it's a much briefer time frame it's referencing, just the 1890s. But I think Soft Countriana, that's her grandma's. Gay 90s is her grandpa's. So they might be representing two sides of the same zeitgeist.
Yeah, absolutely. Because there is, and I guess this kind of relates to what we were talking about before about kind of the 1980s sort of having this trend, consciously or subconsciously, of reinforcing certain like traditional family roles, where I've just found this fascinating because I spend like way too much time looking at like old suburban homes on Zillow and see like what the design, if especially if they're just like left intact. And there's just like a strange, curious little trend from the 80s where, mainly like kind of bigger luxury homes would have, they would have the rest of the home could be like this Soft Countriana look to it, especially the kitchen and like, bedrooms and like children's spaces.
Yeah.
But then there would be like a reserved space, either this super like manly, like wood paneled study with like the little green banker's lamp and like all these like intense like brass fixtures and like antlers on the wall or something like all this strange stuff. It'd be one room of the house, and that'd be like the big study, kind of for like the father of the house. And then in the basement, there would also be, a very gay 90s revival, like fully wood paneled stained glass with like the little bar lamp on it. And like, that would be like the bar down in the basement. It's just there's a very weird coded thing going on here with this that definitely sort of seems to have vanished away. Just like a good thing, but it's an interesting cultural curiosity of that time period that we're kind of delving into.
Yeah. I mean, now people ideally want to have the same aesthetic throughout their whole home.
Yeah.
So do you want to talk about conservatism a bit more in relation to this?
Yeah. This is one where it's like, we are sort of speculating. I mean, with Kari, just as a sort of aside, we would like to, as a goal of our research, be able to contact more firsthand sources about this. So it would be interesting to hear from someone who maybe experienced this. It's like a call to people who I don't know, but it's gonna be tough to reach people with the other grandmas. I don't know, but it's tough because we are piecing this together, kind of from like firsthand physical media sources and things like that. But from my kind of understanding of really trying to piece together the zeitgeist of this era, it kind of comes on the heels of this massive wave of societal change, social change with the 1960s, which really does, it absolutely is true that it was like this huge moment of upheaval.
Mm-hmm.
Where it gets a little bit confusing is that there was massive upheaval and there was this huge upswell, like groundswell of a younger generation being like absolutely dissatisfied with like the really strict societal and like the racism and just like the war of Vietnam, like all these things, absolutely true. And society was able to kind of progress and get things like put into law and get some forward momentum. But that sort of segment of like when you actually look at like the real segment of counterculture protesters and hippies and stuff like that, it's a pretty small segment of the population that was kind of driving a lot of that change. Yeah. And you have this much greater, just wider group of kind of mainstream America that was probably being a little bit dragged along for that. And when that kind of thing happens where you have this, 2 steps forward, you get a little bit of a, 1 step back, or, hopefully just 1 step back. And in that kind of form, I think it results in a bit of a cultural like backlash or something where you have all of this exciting momentum, you have psychedelia, you've got like, and in terms of like these aesthetics that we study, you've got like radical styles coming out of like Italy, and you have, again, as I mentioned, like weird psychedelic home interiors and this big push to kind of environmentalism and all these things. When that happens, I do feel like, especially, there's this much older cohort that existed at that time that was probably looking at this and being like, oh no, like why is this happening? Like this can't be happening. Like we need to get back to like, sort of traditional homespun family values and and try to like, in a sense, sort of, even though they were probably too young to actually experience this at the time, trying to latch onto something and bring it back to sort of pull society again, like back from a little bit of the progressiveness that had been ongoing, which is why I believe that this style emerged in like the early to mid 70s.
I have a little bit of an answer actually I discovered with Laura Ashley, but I want to save that for that section once we get to her. But yes, the morality thing, that definitely had to do with this becoming popular. But yeah, I think we should get to the next section.
Okay.
So typically when I analyze aesthetics, I like to talk about the elements. But this week with you, we're going to talk about motifs, because one of the things Kari should be debuting in the near future is that on the website, they're going to list motifs for the aesthetic, which basically mean recurring images or forms.
Yeah, that's an incredibly... It's really the building blocks of the entire idea of an overarching aesthetic, and being able to break them down into specific, visual motifs, tactile, it could be it really can be anything that you can experience, any sense you can experience, and any sort of technique or artistic technique or particular color palette and things that you can break down into these component parts and then use them to kind of construct whether something is a cohesive style and whether those are used in commonality with each other enough to become a cohesive style. And again, which motifs are shared between certain styles. It's definitely an incredibly core component.
I do like that phrase. Recently with Soft Colonial Wanderlust, with that episode, when I was thinking about hot air balloons, which are the most important like motif of the aesthetic, I'd actually spent quite a lot of time trying to think of the right word to describe how that's used, because it's not a symbol. It's not really representing something too abstract. It's just a repeating image. And that's the perfect word for it. So we're going to get into the motifs now of Soft Countriana. So when I start to think about an aesthetic, I always like to think about what is the color scheme first. How would you describe the color scheme of Soft Countriana?
This one is it's so easy. It's white and pastels.
Yes.
It's got to be white. That sometimes like a darker brown will sneak in there from like a wicker basket and for picnic or something like that. But it is so heavily, specifically centered on this like very particular, clean version of a country style that it's, pastel blues, pastel pinks, very soft, very like easy on the eyes, accessible.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's
I don't
not,
yeah.
it's usually pastel pinks and blues. I mean, sometimes you'll see other colors, but say pastel greens, pastel yellows, those are
Mhm.
excluded for the most part. And something you see with this that, like, you sometimes see it, it's interesting, is sometimes you'll see like a pastel pink or blue paired with a much more saturated pink or blue. And that is
Mm.
something I think is a little unique to this aesthetic. You don't see that very often. Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's a very
Yeah.
interesting. Yeah.
But yeah, I like the color palette. It's very easy. It's super recognizable. But I
Mhm.
think the foundation of this, it's geese or country geese. You know, the very first images you put on your arena page over 3 years ago, they were of country geese. And that was
Nice.
your starting point. So why do you think that was?
Yeah, see, that's one of the great things I think that about our, like about our work where you can see just one image and the fact that it was so omnipresent at one particular moment in time that it made it into like everybody's house no matter where you are, like almost where no matter where you are, that you can just see that and instantly be like, okay, yes, there's something here. I totally
Mhm.
remember that. This is, yeah, it just feels like this weird background to my childhood, is just the fact that there was always there's always a geese. Yeah, there's always a geese something. There is like a geese
Yeah.
on a quilt. There's a little geese statue in the kitchen, and then it also just kind of creates these connections in your mind to like where that sort of starts off, and then you start to realize that there's connections there, like to these other sort of components of this
Yeah.
style.
I have a theory as to why country geese are the heart of this aesthetic, but do you have any ideas? Like, why do you think geese of all the other animals they could have picked?
Geese are something that are nice to look at from afar and very aesthetic, but if you actually interact with them, it can be, like, kind of, like, a bit rough and abrasive and stuff. That kind of sort of represents a little bit about this style, where it's
Yeah.
like you don't actually really want to, get too up and close with a lot of geese. Kind of,
Yeah.
like, nasty and aggressive, but they're very beautiful and stylish in their, like, realm.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's because they're a farm animal, but they're the least useful farm animal, or at
Yeah,
least
it
from an outsider's perspective. There are esoteric reasons to have geese on a farm. You know, they will get rid of insects in crops,
Mm,
particularly in water. But I mean, a lot of people on farms that, you know, are functional where they have other livestock for, you know, to get animal derived products.
mm,
Uh, the geese are just there to look at. They're
mm.
just aesthetic. And I think that's why they feel so Soft Countriana.
Yeah, no, that totally makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah. But an interesting example of the country geese side of things. So I have a listener, Amy. She always has really great feedback on my Discord server. And she alerted me to porch geese. So these are goose lawn ornaments.
Mm,
And I'd mentioned, we talked a little bit about Soft Countriana and Windsor Crafts. So she posted about this a while back. She said, in the 90s, when country geese breached containment and entered the zeitgeist, it morphed into something more kitschy in the form of the dress-up lawn goose statues that you would change the outfits of seasonally. These were huge in the Midwest, and I became obsessed with them a few years ago when I tried to mention them in conversation and realized they're a regional thing. And she actually has an album of these porch geese with their little outfits because she has an aunt from the South who would visit her in the Midwest, and she would like literally take drive-by photos of all of these little goose statues. And there are 3 examples I put on the Pinterest board. One is like perfect. It's wearing a bonnet and it
mm.
has this little wait, what do you call that when you water plants? A watering
A
can.
water, yeah.
It looks like it's from Anti-M Collection, which is like
Okay, yeah.
a very
Got it.
obscure brand that really matches this aesthetic. But yeah, I love these little porch geese outfits though. Did you get a chance to look at the website Miles Kimball?
I did not see that. No, what is okay.
Okay. So Miles Kimball, that's where you can buy outfits for your porch geese as well as the statues themselves, but they're pretty affordable. I mean, a lot of them are between $10 and $15, and you can get them for literally any holiday. So I mean,
Mm,
Flag Day, New Year's Eve, 4th of July, Thanksgiving, Halloween, Christmas, anything you can
mm,
think of. And they try to upsell you because they actually have geese in multiple sizes. There's the standard 23-inch large goose statue, and then there's a 17-inch baby goose statue. And they try to sell you them as like a pair. And then even they have like, in some cases, 4 outfits. So you buy a whole entire nuclear family of porch geese.
oh my god. Okay.
Yeah. I think they're so
Yeah.
cute though. I mean, this is like, I'm not like too much of a consumer personally. I don't go out and buy things to feel good. But there's something so warm about someone having the time, energy, and passion for all of these little holidays and to grow attached to these inanimate objects and put outfits on them. It's like basically Build-A-Bear for grandmas.
Yeah, I mean, it's like personally, I was surprised I was even like I became more and more interested and like more and more appreciative of this style, even like kind of liking it in a way that I just did not expect because of the fact that, you know, it is kind of enticing this idea, especially with I was able to find this one particular, used bookstore where, I don't know what happened, but someone's grandma, unfortunately, there was like 80 books, and they were all these exactly like Soft Countriana craft books
Hmm.
of, how to create your own little, yeah, like country geese or, quilts with bears and bunnies and like all the other stuff that is popular in this style. And, I was sort of finding an appreciation for the fact that there was just this little cottage industry of these particular like folk crafts of
Yeah.
this particular style and how people maybe, you can just sort of imagine that, some mom in like this house would have just everything kind of crafted and themed perfectly around these little styles and just the curation and
Yeah, I mean, she'd
it's
spend her
very,
time being a homemaker.
yeah.
Crafting is a big part of this aesthetic. I mean, on the Pinterest board, you'll see a fair amount of clothing patterns, and like the examples on the outside are great examples.
Oh yeah. Yeah. I was shocked because I basically know nothing about this beyond like my mom sort of dragging me to various places where you would have the little pattern book things, like the fabric pattern books,
Yeah.
and they form such a big part of this style, like the little crafting outfit things.
Yeah. So the next motif I want to talk about, storybook creatures. So we can start out talking about teddy bears and Easter bunnies a little bit. I think Easter, this aesthetic is basically Easter minus pastel yellow and green. Like,
Yes.
I mean, there are less rabbits, but it's kind of like Soft Countriana is Easter 365 days a year. And I think that might be subconscious because Easter, I mean, of the major holidays, it's the most like explicitly Christian. I mean, like fewer people who are like irreligious celebrate Easter than they do Christmas. It's much more of like a truly Christian holiday still. But
That's
yeah.
true. Yeah.
On geese, okay, so there's this really great product that's the overlap between country geese and storybook creatures. It is the talking mother goose. So this was a toy that was sold to children starting in the 80s, and it like was this pretty large animatronic that you would like insert cassettes into, and then it would read you these like classic fairy tales, like Rumpelstiltskin, The Tortoise and the Hare, Hansel and Gretel. And it had like this very soothing voice. It sounded like a grandma was reading you stories. But I mean, there are some really great ads for it that are on the Pinterest board. And then it was also released with Hector the Ugly Duckling.
Okay.
Hector, do think it's kind of like a ugly name, quote unquote. But it's funny that like this like toy company had to pick a name for the ugly duckling, and they were like, it's going to be Hector.
Yeah. I know. Yeah, that's a bit odd. I don't know why they would. Yeah.
Yeah.
Strange to go with that. It doesn't seem like that.
But you could hook up, the mother goose to Hector, and they would like read you stories together. But this, I think, of the like products is like one of the most like Soft Countriana coded that I found this week. But another way to think about this is just instead of it being storybook creatures, quote unquote, it could also just be children's paraphernalia, because I mean, that's what the aesthetics wiki, that's one of the elements that they list. And it could also be, just that more broadly, rocking bears or rocking horses, teddy bears, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of these where we kind of think soft Countriana emerged in like, the early 70s, and we can kind of talk about those earlier sort of iterations of, this sort of soft gauzy type of photography, or like prairie dresses where
Yeah.
it's not specifically just marketed to children. Like a lot of these styles that we study, they'll reach like a saturation point, and if they're particularly attuned to be turned into like a children's marketing aesthetic, they will like instantly, like they will absolutely end up kind of going from like adult to child to market. Once adults get tired of it,
Yeah.
then it gets like relegated to children's marketing. And this happens with a lot of the styles. We have one like, Memphis Milano, which is like Memphis design, super brash, early 1980s style. Once sort of adults kind of got tired of that look and very loud, it kind of even like somewhat obnoxious and colorful, it gets relegated to like children's spaces and things like that. And I mean, honestly, with Soft Countriana, it's basically it was kind of perfect from the start point. It didn't really need that
Yeah.
transitional process. It kind of appealed to all at the same time from the
That
beginning.
makes a lot of sense because, yeah, I mean, the Talking Mother Goose toy that came out in 1986, I believe Hector came out in 1987. So it's towards the tail end of when this
Yeah.
aesthetic was prominent.
Yeah, there's something to be said. We are still working on kind of that idea of yeah, I mean, it's kind of a bit out of the scope of this, but it is interesting how like styles will emerge amongst kind of like a leading edge of the sort of consumer segment or artists that pioneer
Avant-garde.
them. Yeah, they'll merge. They'll kind of those avant-garde artists will kind of create these. And my best example again is very quick. Is just when we have something called wacky pomo, and that's
Mhm.
another style that we study. One of the earliest best examples of that would be Pee-wee's Adventures. And again, that's marketed to children, but it's created by really like an avant-garde artist, and it's incredibly well crafted and is working with all these like new wave artists, like Gary Panter in LA, in the LA scene. But then like right by the time you reach like the late 1990s, you have kind of all the like exciting artistic craft sort of sucked right out of it. And it's basically like, McDonald's marketing aesthetic, kind of buried down to its like both base elements and stuff like that. And seeing an aesthetic kind of have that lifespan and life cycle, it happens over and over again. We've just sort of noticed with that. And it's still, again, the case with Soft Countriana because like, as you're mentioning, by the time like the early 1990s roll around, it is now so oversaturated as like a children's toy marketing aesthetic
Uh-huh.
that is wildly uncool. Even with like suburban moms, they've moved on, and we can talk about that later, but they've moved on to something else by
Yeah.
that point.
Yeah. And then the next motif, the Victorian era, I don't think we have to go too into this because we talked about how this aesthetic really emerged out of it. But a lot of the designs I learned were actually appropriated one-to-one. I mean, there are some that were sort of modern twist or Victoriana, but a lot of them actually were directly sampled.
Yeah, with this style, I was kind of surprised because unlike kind of the soft colonial wanderlust or gay 90s revival, I've just noticed it seems, especially with like the home marketing, home goods segment,
Hmm.
they don't really use any of the they don't use a lot of the imagery. They'll have this like they'll either have new illustrators kind of create in the style of that, which is as one of the artists that we mentioned, Paula Vaughan is just like a great example of this like new wave of illustrators that emerged in the 80s and then like kind of marketed themselves as kind of the entire like the ability to create like an entire world of Soft Countriana in their own kind of little brand. And she would have book after book after book. It was like one I have is like the romantic world of Paula Vaughan or something like
Yeah.
that. And they would
Those
craft
are, what are they called? Like cross stitch? What's that?
those two. She would do, I mean, like any like painting, like little paintings, illustrations,
Oh,
but
okay.
yeah, a lot of cross stitch, quilting books. And yeah, they would sort of mimic these earlier illustrations, but then in some cases they would be like pastel, again, like updated pastelized for the 80s and adding in some sort of contemporary elements to kind of bring it into the modern sort of home for that particular demographic that was in the 80s. Like they wanted something that was like sort of still spoke to them as being like, I'm not living in 1890, like I am sort of actually in the 1980s. But then again, they would also have, and you can see it a lot on the homewares, as we mentioned, in like the Auntie M collection.
Yes.
It would have this like almost you can very much tell it's from the 80s because it's like coming off of the 1970s, which the 70s was so heavily into this abstracted form of illustration that we kind of refer to as like super graphic, ultra modern. And
Yeah.
it's very like minimalist and stuff. So you get, country quilt patterns, but it's just like literal blocks of color. It's very simplified, like triangles and blocks and things, and just little motifs splattered here and there, or like a very stylized country geese or a stylized, woman with a little bonnet on her or something like that. And it's just sort of interesting it's like you can tell it's coming off of this other time period, and it's not like a purely sort of one-to-one recreation of that earlier era. But there's some instances where they're just reusing stuff.
Yeah,
but
so
some
it's
of them are,
both. It's not just
Yeah.
one or the other.
yeah, they kind of mixing it together with these
Yeah.
different styles.
Yeah. And then the final motif, country living. So this is oftentimes in the background of, say, Soft Countriana ads. You'll see these really lush environments. I really love that image you already mentioned of the woman who's in a straw hat staring into a pond, like dipping a stick into it. Because it just feels romantic. That looks like it could be an impressionist painting or something, but it's an ad from the 80s.
Yeah, it's an ad for wallpaper or something.
Really?
I think I pulled it, or there's, well, that one's an illustration, again, I think from one of those Paula Vaughan books, but there's another one that, it's just like a woman like luxuriating in a gazebo with, it's similar thing with like just in the grass outside of a gazebo.
Yeah.
And it's just an advertisement for little flower print wallpaper or something like that. Just like,
I mean, thinking about this topic this week, it made me realize there's so many like leisurely ways to explore or enjoy the outdoors, like say going for a stroll by the pond, a tea party, like listening to a band at the gazebo. Like,
yeah, I mean, it seems again tied to that, the idea of like, I mean, I remember that I read about like it was like a theme park in Pittsburgh or something, and reading about the history of it, and just the idea that, because of these new like railroads and streetcars, like Victorian women and families would take like day trips out to the country, and the theme park would just be like hanging out in a park with picnics. Like, and picnics were a new phenomenon.
Well, there
at the
were,
time.
trolley parks at the end of, streetcar lines. That was a way that they would try to get income, particularly in the weekends, because streetcars, I mean, they would get the most traffic, for commuters. But then, like, these streetcar owners, they would try to think of ways to get more income. So they'd build, like, small amusement parks at the end of streetcar lines.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that's really fascinating.
Yeah. But another way that the countryside country living is incorporated into this, it's through, rustic household goods, jams, jellies, things like that. But I think prairie dresses are the most signature article of clothing that really like make you think about this. And I want to discuss Laura Ashley more in depth now. She's really fascinating. I didn't know really anything about her or her brand before this week. When you first, thought of Soft Countriana, were you thinking about Laura Ashley initially?
So, yeah, I knew Laura Ashley, like, that's one of the ones where the only way I knew of anything about this sort of style existing is that it was just known as like the Laura Ashley aesthetic. It's like people have already like, they've spoken about Laura Ashley, and that's like been in the background, but beyond that, like that's seemingly the only way that most people talk about this style is like through their experience and exposure to, various Laura Ashley decorated home interiors from like their, childhood or something like that.
Yeah. We met up last night. We went to this event together, and we were trying not to talk about today's topic, but we talked about Laura Ashley a little bit, and I like theorized that this aesthetic, I mean, if you take that approach of like, okay, she was like extremely dominant, like this aesthetic is defined by her, it can be the aesthetic equivalent of a musical idiom. A musical idiom, that's a phrase me and Joseph came across for an episode we did on Manouche Jazz, and how Django Reinhardt, that whole genre of music, basically everyone who's playing Manouche Jazz, like half of what they're doing is just covers of Django Reinhardt. And I don't know if that's true for Soft Countriana, where half of this style, like everyone was just copying her. But she was prolific enough that might be the case, because by the time her company reached its peak, which was shortly before her death after her 60th birthday, it was valued at $200 million. They had 4,000 workers, and it was one of the biggest clothing retailers in Britain at the time. But I can talk about the history a little bit. So Laura Ashley, it's a British clothing brand that was founded by Laura Ashley. It's an eponymous brand. And she was initially inspired after she went to see an exhibit at the Victorian Albert Museum in London. It was of British handcrafts, and she got the idea to invest in creating her own textiles. She initially made a £10 investment and created napkins, table mats, and tea towels with these hand-printed designs. And the company experienced its first real success pretty quickly after she started producing headscarves that were popularized by Audrey Hepburn at the time. But overall, the brand, it's known for these dresses. I mean, above everything else, it's these striking dresses with hand-printed fabrics with Victorian silhouettes. And I actually learned as part of research this week that Laura Ashley herself, she couldn't sketch, like at all. So she actually did what you kind of do, where she collects all of these books and she would just have them on hand. She'd constantly be looking through them and she'd point to particular designs and be like, I want to put that into production.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, because Laura Ashley was just an absolutely like just dominant sort of lifestyle brand that covered not just fashion, but in a lot of cases, it's very prevalent in these soft countryana like home interiors. As she had so many different books and kind of entered into all these different markets and design fields that just proliferated like everywhere, and it became just a huge overarching style that gets. I do see it commented on in media of the time and like design criticism of the oversaturation of the Laura Ashley look.
Yeah, it was one of the first lifestyle brands. I mean, she was really a pioneer in that sense where she turned it into, I mean, it started with just clothing, with textiles, and then it was like every piece of homeware you can almost think of. She did that because it wasn't really super financial for her. She was incredibly successful with her company, but it was because what she was selling, or her idea was less so selling a lifestyle as it was morality. That's what I referenced earlier, where there is this real morality throughout the aesthetic. But you know who wore the brand that's really the most famous? Did you know like Princess Diana would wear Laura Ashley?
I mean, I just learned that for kind of this episode. Really, I did not know. I mean, it kind of sort of makes sense
Yeah.
for her overall sort of aesthetic.
Yeah, I mean, if people are still lost, if you are listening to this episode and you still haven't Googled what Laura Ashley or Soft Countriana are, like just think of Princess Diana wearing like a long frilly dress that looks kind of 70s or 80s. That's Laura Ashley. And, you know, it appealed to princesses and conservative grandmas alike because it was very modest. Because Laura Ashley, she was like directly copying these Victorian styles without very much modification. Like they weren't very revealing, and they appealed to those subsets for the same reasons.
Yeah, I mean, looking back at this style, like, with this sort of, 40-year gap in it, it honestly does seem sort of bizarre, like that this ever like
Ever
happened. Like
happened?
that
Yeah.
it's so strange in the context, like when we think of it in the context of like
The
the rest of history.
70s.
Yeah, the 70s and the 80s, like even when people sort of look back and have like I mean, now if they have their retro 80s party or retro 70s party, no one dresses up like a frilly frumpy like prairie dress. Like, it's very strange, like with tons of lace and a thing. Like the fact that it was like looking at all of these examples and noticing how like really omnipresent it was, especially like children's clothing and like even like I think there's an example like I have of the outfit of like the secretary in Ferris Bueller's Day Off or something. Like she has this very like
Oh, yeah.
poofy shoulders, frilly, with lots of frills at the bottom. And it's like when I actually look at this, like thinking about it and being like, well, this is sort of strange. Like this is a very weird period in time that this was just seen as so normal for a little moment. And then it really just vanished because it just
Yeah.
does not.
It feels very anachronistic. You know, when I started doing research for this episode, I did the math. I was like, okay, if someone is a grandma in the 70s or 80s, would they have been able to experience the Victorian era directly? I mean, yes, if you're in your 80s or 90s, but I encountered a piece of information in relation to Laura Ashley that provides a different explanation that's more even more nuanced and interesting. So there was a piece in the New York Times, The Enduring Appeal of Laura Ashley, where they mention Laura and her younger sister, Mary, were often sent by train to Wales to visit their grandmother and great aunts, and it was there that they witnessed a strict Baptist household with polished brass fixtures and women with mending in their laps. It was a world where neither moral values nor furniture had changed much in the previous 50 years, and it surely contributed to the young girl's idealization of the Victorian and Edwardian eras. And this references this idea I've heard before, where basically, if you think about a rural place, a suburban place, and the social norms in a particular time, you often have to go back a few decades, usually 10 or 20, not 50, like this article is saying, because that's insane. But I don't know a lot about Wales or what it was like in the 70s and 80s, but I mean, I can imagine it maybe having, social conventions that were 50 years behind.
Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
it seems like that's feasible. I mean, things can move a
Yeah.
lot slower in England in terms of rapid change. Like they didn't have, I mean, they definitely had a lot of, damage from world wars and things like that. But like the UK, even if you look at it now, I mean, there's a lot of these older cities that remain and didn't.
Yeah.
There's even an interesting, that reminds me of the fact that like, I believe there's a commercial from the 90s where IKEA like literally targeted the UK because they were so like, I mean, it was like they were so frustrated and they were like really trying to hit this particular market in the UK that they made a commercial called like "Chuck Out Your Chintz."
I've
And
seen
it's
that, yeah.
like just the fact that the homes had remained so like stuck and stayed in that way that you were like have to freshen them up for the 90s, and like, you could have had a house that really had this old, I mean not that old, but like 50 years out of date or something like that, or 20 or 30 years out of date. But the fact that things can move a lot slower, I think,
Yeah.
in that context.
Yeah. I love this quote though, because it makes me realize that, nostalgia, you can reach back to decades, if you're in the right time or the right place, that, you're not part of the avant-garde, that you are in a place that has remained more like stable, consistent. Yeah. I mean, this explains like why these older women were reaching back towards the Victorian era when they didn't experience it directly. It's because they mostly were like in rural places where there was more tradition and they felt connected to this more so than the present.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's definitely like an aspect, and I think you can also add the fact that, like, as sort of I mentioned before, like when an era sort of reaches that status of romanticization, and the fact that with the gay 90s and the Belle Epoque and all the Victorian, and like the fact that it had reached it so early, like starting in the 1920s, the fact that it can be ongoing for so long and then like entrench itself into culture and become this like omnipresent idea that gets regurgitated through different generations, like that, the fact that it can reach that level of like saturation within the collective culture, the fact that like someone in the 70s would maybe even know, like even if they're like 30 or something, would know about the gay 90s or something like that, just through the sort of the cultural osmosis of having it be around in so many pieces of media and having it exist in the like designed landscape with like fake themed fern bars and stuff like that. Like that idea of having it reach such a level of cultural consciousness that it becomes a touch point because it's known, like it has these particular terms of like association of being like, of a time of like, tradition, but also, conservatism, but also like of great, wealth and stuff like that.
Yeah.
It becomes a touch point for people to mimic it when they're looking to sort of go back to tradition. Like when a conservative turn happens, there can be styles that are like ready and waiting for people to latch back onto because they become such perfect representations of that idea. And that's happened now with like, the 50, like Return and Make America Great Again, like that type of garbage, like that kind of stuff then latches on to like the 50s in America, even though it's well out of date for even most of the living population. And it's like not relevant really, but it's reached such a point in people's like collective consciousness that it can serve that purpose. It's interesting. I'd wonder if it has some aspect in Soft Countriana of having that function, especially because like when you see like the prairie dresses marketed to like younger women or something, like 20s in their 20s and 30s in the 70s, and like prom dresses or something, and like the late 70s like could look like this, they're obviously not remotely tied to that time period at all, but they can see it either through like what you mentioned where, they can have connections through like their older relatives, or maybe like going back to their hometown that hasn't changed, or just also how these aesthetics form this just collective, like these touch points that people can, like they can connect through them or something. They form this like connective tissue in society that people will latch on to because they become shorthand for something. I don't know. It's just like, I wonder about it. It's tough to, a little nebulous with.
Yeah. No, it's interesting. I mean, I think, this could be part of the explanation for that, for sure. Yeah. And then did you want to talk about country SF or country San Francisco? You said it's one of your favorite examples of this style.
Yeah, kind of speaking to, this idea of like how was this sort of soft Countriana style expressed in the built environment. That store is a great example because it's such a strange example, and I definitely recommend anybody to check it out. I think it's on the Pinterest board.
Yeah, I'm going to link in the show notes the article. It's also on the Pinterest board. It's pretty short. It's 2 pages with actual text, and then there are 2 other images associated with the article, right?
Yeah, it's just a very odd example because it's what it sort of represented is that, and it's noted in the article that this particular style, and they just sort of call it like American country or something. They're like, American country, these crafts and all these products have become the biggest marketing segment in American history. They're so like the way they speak about it is like, this is the greatest thing marketers ever discovered, was be able to like merchandise and craft this sort of country style that they can then kind of like replicate back out to the consumer, But the strange thing about it is this aesthetic put in the context of a very strange mixture of sort of postmodern design mixed with, and they even note it, like German expressionism, which is like, if kind of the best example of that is this movie, the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, which is like it's a very disturbed aesthetic. It's like everything's askew. It's meant to unsettle you, and mixing together this style of like, homey country crafts and ribbons and bunnies, and putting it together with like odd, askew, scary houses like falling down at you, in this like sort of oddly darkened space on the end of a pier.
Pier 39.
Pier 39 in San Francisco. It just sort of shows, I think what it shows best is that style had reached such an insane level of cultural saturation in America, especially at that time, that you have the more like avant-garde architectural side of culture playing with it and like doing something, doing these like strange experimentations with it. I think that, along with, I'd say that's one of the best examples. There's a lot more, straightforward examples of these just really
of Soft Countriana in the built environment.
The fact that, there are these stores that are just like overstuffed with this endless amounts of frilly lace and but like it is heavily in that realm of 1980s excess of just absolutely overload every interior and fill it every square inch with a sellable product and theme everything per, the investment level that people had on spending money and theming these environments around like a Victorian gazebo. And it also, additionally, the fact that this style made it out of just these more short-lived spaces of retail and restaurants and things. There are some examples of this actually in the suburban environment that I had found, which there was a real sort of, it seems like a brief sort of brief fad in the 1980s of trying to recreate these sort of farm-themed suburban developments. And they would have, they would absolutely be themed little Victorian houses. They would sometimes omit garages, specifically to kind of get rid of that suburban 1950 post-war aesthetic. And they would just have driveways. They would be arranged along curving roads, and they try to give them a little bit more space and bucolic sort of look to it, and have lots of landscaping and these old homey fonts and things, and trying to craft literally sort of falling right out of this style, coming right out of this style, an actual like living Soft Countriana. Like you could live in Soft Countriana and like this idealized bucolic environment without actually having to do like the farm work or anything. It's strange to see those. They didn't last particularly long, and they're sort of few and far between, but there are actual built Victorian revival homes, and especially in the 1980s.
There's some on the Arena page, right?
Yeah, there's some good examples of that. Was certainly a wave in suburban home design in like the 80s and 90s, and certainly fizzled out.
I can picture it in my head, but yeah.
It's pretty poorly done. I mean, honestly, it's hard to replicate the intense level of craft and ornamentation of a Victorian home when you're doing it with like vinyl siding and like one little piece of fretwork or something. It doesn't turn out so like authentic.
Yeah. I mean, the concept's cool though. But okay, one thing that's a little unrelated to what you're just saying. Okay, I do want to just talk about the rule purge briefly, just because, in this time frame, in the 70s through to the 90s, I mean, starting in the 70s, Soft Countriana emerges. It's a celebration of rural lifestyles and this idealization of country living. But at the same time, there was the rural purge. Are you familiar with that term?
Yeah, I've delved somewhat into television history and television culture a fair amount. So I'm familiar with that idea of the popularity of these. Yeah,
starting in the 70s, there was this really broad wave of cancellations of what were previously rural-themed TV shows, like, the Beverly Hillbillies, Green Acres, and Hee Haw. And they got replaced with programs in more urban settings. And so, I was just trying to pose the question of like, okay, well, if one facet of society is like gravitating towards like country living and the other swath of the public is not, according to what happened with the rural purge, like what was going on. But it is just that it's another example of just how like decades prior to the emergence of the internet were not as monocultural as I initially thought.
Yeah, no, there's all these different threads and demographics of people that are like and like cultures that are within America, even at that time, obviously, that are wildly different from each other, what they want. And
Yeah.
that I was looking at that rural purge because what they had mentioned in it is that even though they really wanted to just like get rid of these programs, move on to something like fresher, more exciting, maybe more progressive,
Yeah.
those programs were still wildly popular. Like most of them were at the time of their cancellation. It's not like they were like really dwindling that much. It's more just like a hard cutoff, and it ties back again, to this constant thing in America of like, the culture wars and stuff like that, where it's just like there is a push and pull, between all these different like demographics of people and age and everything that are, whether maybe like the sort of similar things like boomers watching CBS now, like watching like 57 different cop shows or something, and the privilege of that in our current society versus maybe that was kind of something that was going on back then. A lot of like their older viewers and rural viewers.
I could totally imagine if this happened today, there would be massive public discourse if like Fox News was like, they're canceling all the TV shows that were set in the countryside. Like that would be in the news cycle.
Oh yeah. 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 I mean, it's like what we're talking about. It's like that, what I mentioned before about culture at that time. And I've like watched a few interesting documentaries about this, about how people felt very like lost in the 70s after like the big wave of, the cultural counterculture and all this social upheaval in the 60s. They were like losing this idea of like, okay, what should we do? Like, traditional religion may have been like sort of not giving the right answers to people. So that goes off into a whole different trajectory about like the rise of like cults in the 70s and like the weird, like, I think it's like the fourth great awakening. I don't know how many the great awakening, but there's one for the 70s that led to like, televangelists and stuff. And you have this weird like shift in culture where people are searching for spiritualism and stuff like that. And that idea of people feeling sort of lost and certain cohorts of people going towards like, alternate forms of like religion, and maybe different segments of the population turning fairly conservative, and again, looking back to this like, back to this Victorian, soft Countriana style.
Interesting.
You wonder about it. Yeah.
Yeah. But you know what is one exception to the rural purge? It's the TV show Little House on the Prairie, because that came out in 1974. And I looked into Little House on the Prairie a little bit for this week. It's not a show I ever watched, but I was interested in trying to think about how does this connect to this aesthetic, because I've also heard it referenced in relation to cottagecore. Cottagecore, for those that don't know, but most of our audience will know, it's one of the biggest aesthetics to emerge out of TikTok. And it's sampling from the same references, but it looks really different.
Yeah, cottagecore is kind of fascinating to me because I think of cottagecore as honestly being more like a much more realistic sort of actual vision of cottage life. I mean, it's still very like stylized romanticization of like country living and cottage living that obviously doesn't match up exactly to the reality of what it would be like. And it's, especially coming from TikTok, which, has a lot of issues with like how it sort of chops up pieces of culture and then remixes them to things and it omits like, it's obviously not very realistic representation, but that, I mean, from what I understand of, and I haven't delved super deep into cottagecore, it at least does have some elements of like, maybe, doing some actual work or like, do like actual, a little bit of farming and like creating your own, like, growing your own crops or just, it's also a little bit more naturalistic looking. It does
look that way to me.
Yeah.
Like, I don't have the eye for cottagecore. I mean, like a lot of aesthetics, I can tell the difference between real sea-punk, fake sea-punk, health goth, same thing. But I've never been into cottagecore, so I didn't exactly know like how to differentiate the two. But based off of like what I think is the real thing, I'm like, this just looks like almost like photos people took with their phone camera. Like this is not.
Yeah. Like it's just stylized. Like actual. Yeah. It's like an actual little stone cottage or something. It's not like, a faux Victorian gazebo or something. Like that's why I differentiate these styles so much. I mean, Soft Countriana is very synthetic. I mean, it's from a time period when those conversations about making sure you're authentic or like having like, low eco footprint or like having authentic creations of stuff did not matter. I mean, probably in some circles it did, but like to the extent of today, not remotely. Just not like people did not, especially people that were consuming this style did not care about that whatsoever.
Yeah. But to address it directly, okay, so cottagecore, I mean, the arena page that you created for this initially, it says that it might be related to cottagecore, but it doesn't seem like, the people who invented cottagecore on TikTok, they weren't thinking about Soft Countriana at all.
No, I mean, when I really look at whatever pops up for the most representative images of cottagecore, which now seems like difficult with like, so you get like AI results or something. But like, if you try to piece that together, it is more of like a reality. It's like it's real places. It's not. It's even like it's like real fabrics, real like handcrafted element, like a lot
Hmm.
more emphasis on handcrafted, actual farming, actual like pickling a vegetable. Like it's much more like it is less like aesthetic ideal. I mean, it is pretty like idealized, but I'd say a lot less so than this
A
style.
lot less, yeah.
It's a lot less divorced from reality than this style is. This style, again, as we're kind of mentioning, it's like romanticizing a romanticization. It's like two layers deep of like it's romanticizing streetcar suburb living or something in the Victorian era of the UK and the US, which already was sort of divorced from actual farm life in the real rural countryside, like at that time. Like, so it's
Yeah.
not, it's, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about it, how would someone living in a streetcar suburbs get to the pond that is depicted in, my favorite image for this aesthetic? It's like, yeah, like how would a woman wearing all white get to a place like that?
Yeah, I mean, you either that's like, and that like ties back to like those, because in that time period they're building all these like parks. You get like Frederick Law Olmsted, like Olmsted
Yeah,
doing like Central Park, and like your trolley parks that you're mentioning. Like, there's a big push to create these curated, designed, romanticized park spaces that they're not natural. Like they're not like just exactly
yeah.
exist like purely. Yeah,
I kind
sorry.
of like those though, personally. I mean,
Yeah.
I'm an urbanist. The podcast, I mean, you're familiar with us because we do aesthetic
Mm.
episodes, but the majority it's urbanism. And like, I have the hot take that I think that cities should just have like really big destination parks that are like, sort of those fantasy parks like Olmsted created. That's what I like. I don't like these really tiny ones that, your dogs can go poop in every block. Like, that's not really as fun. But yeah.
Oh yeah, no, I totally, yeah, no, yeah, I definitely agree. Like more large parks in every city as possible.
Yeah. Do you have any final notes on Soft Countriana?
All I would add is that kind of two things, which I do find it interesting that this style has really helped piece together something in my head in relationship to kind of like tracking the trajectory of a lot of these sort of different styles, especially like ones marketed towards like suburban mom or grandma demographic,
Yeah.
is that it has a really clear line trajectory from this style and the sort of folksy craft aspect of it, then evolving into this later style that's out of the scope of this episode, but it is definitely the very clear like
Successor.
successor to this style, which we don't have a name for. I have a bunch of adjectives for it. It's like 90s primitive Americana, folk, shabby chic, country style. Mostly, it's like in the 90s, it was referred to as primitive Americana, I think mainly. And that was the dominant country style of that time period. And I remember it very well because it was huge in Virginia where I grew up. That's probably one of the most perfectly centered styles for that area. But that became the dominant style well into like the 2000s. And then at that point, it evolves into what we call like and what most people know, the live, laugh, love aesthetic, which is like
Wait,
then
that
yeah.
can be traced back to Soft Countriana.
I believe it can definitely has
Wow.
like these roots, these like really like ancient, it's like, yeah, like ancient roots in Soft Countriana because you can see the demographics sort of align with it and they're later, but you can see some of the motifs kind of like start to emerge. Like the perfectly painted like little Victorian furniture will get like shabbier in the 90s. The paint will get like worn off and it's like, oh, that's like more primitive Americana, shabby chic. And then like in the 2000s, it'll get totally ripped off, like totally wiped off,
Yeah.
and you get this much more like was it like
Minimal.
rustic? It was like like rustic, and then later on, it becomes the modern transitional Joanna Gaines farmhouse type thing in the 2010s and the later 2000s and 2010s, and even up until now. So it's formed a really like coherent part for me, like in my mind, to help piece together this sort of the trajectory of this style and the evolution of it.
Yeah. So this aesthetic never really died. It just had spiritual successors.
In a sense, yeah. I mean, it kind of because it serves a niche or
Yeah,
something
that
like
key
that.
demo,
Yeah, yeah,
grandmas, they're always gonna be around. So
yeah. Yeah.
yeah. So do you have anything you want to plug for our audience? Your Instagram?
Yeah, no, I mean, where am I most? I'm trying to be a little more active on the Instagram. It's tough to keep up with kind of social media and the research this time, but I do have my Instagram is Evan Collins 90. I'm most active again on the Arena page.
Yeah.
If you link that, like I'm constantly working on that, and especially new avenues of research and like new channels. I'm really deeply involved right now with piecing together 2000s vector graphic design aesthetics. I know, total like whiplash from this sort of style, but right now I am like on a intense mission to help figure out what people call Fruitiger Metro. I'm working.
Yeah.
I am like
Trying
working
to find a
around the
better
clock.
name.
I am, and I have. I've been calling it either Vector Delia or Vector Pop because that's a much more close relation to what it actually sort of represents. But you can. I don't want to get too deep into that now because it goes on forever. But like, you can check out my Arena page for that, and I've got like a whole explanation, reasoning why that. But I do find that one particularly fascinating because the 2000s is what I kind of call this, like, it really is like a Cambrian explosion of all these different, mainly vector-based design styles, and really the emergence of like online design culture and communities. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, one thing I don't want you to not plug is your Patreon. People should go support it if they can. One thing they get access to if they support you is they get access to this really large Google Drive folder that's full of all of these books that you've personally scanned that you own. And I actually went through them recently. I've been subscribed to your Patreon for a while, but I recently did an episode on fine dining. And I went through every single book that had the word restaurant in the title, like literally every page.
Wow.
And I found one that worked for that episode because it was on fine dining. There was this really cool restaurant that once existed in San Francisco called Etrusca. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, no, you sent that. That was interesting because it reminded me so much of like the emergence of what we now sort of refer to as I don't even know, it has so many names, like Tuscan rustic, or I call it like kind of old world luxe, like old world European styles, like all got melange together in the 90s and 2000s, especially Tuscan. But yeah, no, that was a really great example of that because we've been diving into it and the origins of that style recently. And the fact that I think what I find particularly fascinating with that is how it emerged quite a bit earlier than a lot of people think. It's heavily associated with like the run up to the 2008 Great Recession. Like and there's so many like TikToks of people like reminiscing about their friends
Recession
Tuscan
kitchens.
Yes, the giant overwrought Tuscan kitchens and all the, oh my god, it's a really ridiculous aesthetic. I have like a fondness for it in a weird way, but I do recommend, as I mentioned, like the aspect of it being about a lot earlier than expected. I would recommend 100% the book You Deserve Beautiful Rooms by Perla Ligi. It is an incredible overview from the year 2000 about her design work, and it is that style to a T, and it's like perfectly sort of crystallized even by like the year 2000. She has it like totally down, all the giant Tuscan kitchens and the rustic finishes and stuff. It's really fun.
Interesting to see the origin of this aesthetic because it looks a lot more Roman than I kind of expected. The Tuscany part, I mean, it could be referencing medieval or Renaissance Tuscany, but it seemed like the earlier artists were thinking about ancient Rome a little bit more. And with Etrusca, the Etruscan culture. But
yeah, no, it totally has, because I mean, like, delving into kind of the really quickly, like where these sort of came from. If you look in the late 80s, there's actually this huge fad of like faux green patinaed Roman furniture. Like it's hard to explain, but it's like this really stringy metal furniture. You can usually use it on your patio, and has all the intense green patinas and like all the faux finishes on your Roman columns and things like that. That definitely forms the basis. You can like see where that could evolve into this style like later on, and then much later on the whole Tuscan, and that's not even rustic. It's like rustic. You got to be kidding me. Like there's huge McMansions and stuff there. But yeah.
Thank you for coming on, Evan. It was fun discussing Soft Countriana. It's always a real pleasure, a real treat to get to be, amongst the first people to really think about these things in depth. So thank you.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, I appreciate your really deep insight and like incredible. You always have incredible research that goes beyond, sometimes definitely like what we've even looked into and brings up like totally different new avenues and examples. So I
Thank
really
you.
appreciate that.
I appreciate that.
Mhm.
Okay. Bye, everyone.
Bye bye.